My wife told her mother, "He will never achieve what I have." A week later, her lawyer called me with a trembling voice. The apartment, the car, the company. None of it is in her name. She was stunned and finally understood what she never cared to ask. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My wife's lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning. His voice was trembling. A man who charged $500 an hour with a voice trembling like someone who just discovered something he shouldn't have discovered. And the first thing he said, no greetings, no beating around the bush, was this: "Miguel, the apartment, the car, the partnership, none of it is in her name." Silence. "Miguel, are you listening to me?" "Yes," I told him. "I hear you perfectly." What Raphael didn't know at that moment was that I'd been waiting for that call. Not with anxiety, not with revenge on my mind. I've been waiting for it with the same calm with which one waits for the dawn after a very long night, because I knew that moment would come. I knew it since that night my wife told her mother, in a low but perfectly audible voice, that I'd never get to where she had. And I was sitting less than 4 meters away holding a glass of wine that no one had offered me, that I'd poured myself in the apartment that was in my name, listening as the two women decided in whispers what my place in the world was. What neither of them knew was what that place really was. When Raphael finished talking to me that Tuesday, when he explained with a trembling voice that he'd reviewed every document, every deed, every legal record, and that absolutely nothing of what Carolina thought was hers was in her name, I asked him a single question. "Have you told her yet?" There was a long pause. "Yes," he answered. "I just hung up with her." I pictured her face at that moment. I imagined Carolina holding the phone, paralyzed, trying to process something her mind refused to accept, because Carolina was a woman who always knew exactly where she stood. A woman who never doubted her position, who never doubted her level, who for 11 years looked at me as if I were a man to whom life had given less than he deserved, and she'd had the generosity to stay anyway. That was always the narrative, hers, her mother's, that of the small circle of people who on weekends filled our living room and drank the wine I paid for without knowing who paid for it. But for you to understand how we got to that call, I need to take you back 11 years. Because this story doesn't start with legal documents or a trembling lawyer. It starts with a dinner, with a phrase said in a low voice, and with a decision I made in silence that same night while I finished my glass and no one at that table was paying attention to me. A decision Carolina never noticed, because to notice something you first have to be looking. And she had stopped looking at me a long time ago. I met Carolina 14 years ago. She was a sales consultant at a real estate firm. She'd walk into places with that energy that makes people turn their heads without knowing exactly why. Confident, precise, with a way of speaking that made it clear from the first moment that she knew what she wanted. I found it admirable, genuinely admirable. And for the first few years, it was. We got married 3 years after we met, and at first things worked, or at least I thought so, because over time I understood that what I called working was actually a dynamic where I supported and she shone, where I built in silence and she showed off in public, where I gave in and she concluded without ever asking me what I thought, because my opinion wasn't part of the equation. It didn't bother me at first. I'm a man who doesn't need applause to know who he is. I built what I built without anyone seeing me do it, and that never lost me any sleep. But there's a huge difference between not needing recognition and tolerating contempt. And that line with Carolina disappeared so slowly that for a long time I didn't realize it no longer existed. The first clear sign came on the birthday of Antonia. Her mother, a woman who from day one treated me with that cold courtesy reserved for people one considers below their circle, but must tolerate for family reasons. There were about 12 people around the table that night, brothers-in-law, family friends, acquaintances from Carolina's work. Someone asked me what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Carolina intervened with a smile and said, "Miguel, he handles some investments. Nothing too complicated." Nothing too complicated. I smiled, nodded, and kept eating. No one at that table knew that 3 days earlier I had closed a $1,200,000 deal. No one knew that the firm appearing on that contract was mine, that the building mentioned in that document was mine, that the name listed as the ultimate owner behind 2 corporate structures was mine. No one knew because I didn't say it, and Carolina didn't know because she'd never asked. She'd never sat down to ask me, with genuine curiosity, what exactly it was that I did. She had built her own version of me and had lived comfortably within that version for years, and I had let her. Because sometimes the most powerful decision you can make isn't to correct someone, it's to let them keep believing what they believe and wait. The months following that dinner for Antonia's birthday were, on the surface, completely normal. Carolina would get up early, get ready with that precision of hers that always seemed almost military to me, drink her coffee standing in front of the window, and leave without saying much. I'd stay at the table, finish mine slowly, and after the door closed, I'd open my computer and start working. That's how most of our mornings had been for years. What Carolina didn't know, what she never stopped to observe, was what I did after that door closed. Not because I hid it with effort, but because she had never been curious enough to ask. My computer was always open. I made my calls from the study without lowering my voice. My documents were on the table, sometimes on top of the breakfast. But for Carolina, all of that was part of a landscape that didn't deserve attention. I was the background of her life, the white noise, the man who was there, but who didn't require focus. One morning, Manuel called me to confirm the details of a transfer. It was $50,000 that needed to be moved before the end of the quarter. We talked for 20 minutes in the dining room with the door open. Carolina passed by the hallway twice. The second time she stopped for a moment, looked at me, and I made a gesture with my hand as if to say, "It's work, I won't be long." She nodded and kept walking. $50,000. And she kept walking. Manuel had been my partner for 12 years. A discreet, methodical man, with a financial intelligence that few people in his field could match. We had built a structure together that from the outside was completely invisible. That wasn't an accident, it was by design. From the beginning, when I started accumulating properties and company shares, I made a decision that at the time seemed simply prudent, but which over the years became something much more important. I never put anything in my personal name. Everything was organized through holdings, clean, solid legal structures built with Francisco, the notary who had handled my affairs since before Carolina and I got married. Francisco was a man of few words and much precision, the type of professional who doesn't ask unnecessary questions and who also doesn't give information he's not asked for. Perfect for what I needed. When Carolina and I got married, she didn't sign anything related to those structures. Not because I had actively hidden it, but because she never asked. Her own lawyer reviewed the prenuptial agreement, a man Carolina chose because he seemed impressive in their first meeting. She paid him $2,000 for a review that lasted 40 minutes. That lawyer found nothing because there was nothing in my personal name to find. And Carolina was satisfied because the document said what she wanted it to say. Separation of assets. What's mine is mine. What's yours is yours. Exactly. What Carolina understood as hers was the apartment where we lived, the car she drove, the share in the company where she worked. What she never knew was that the apartment was registered in the name of one of my holdings since before we moved in, that the car was owned by another corporate structure linked to the same network. That the company where she thought she had a significant stake had a majority shareholder who had never appeared in any dinner table conversation. That shareholder was me. But let's go back to those months after the dinner, because it was during that period that I began to notice that something had changed in Carolina, not in her behavior towards me, which remained the same, but in her confidence, in the way she spoke, in the way she made decisions. She started making plans without consulting me. Not everyday plans, that was already common. I mean big plans. One weekend she came home and informed me, not asked, informed me that she had decided to remodel the kitchen. She showed me the quotes she had requested. The cheapest was $18,000. "I've already chosen the contractors," she said. "They start next month." I looked at her and nodded. "Okay," I said. She expected me to argue, to ask where the money was coming from, to put up some kind of resistance. When I didn't, something in her expression changed briefly, almost imperceptibly, as if my lack of reaction disconcerted her more than a fight would have. But she dismissed it quickly. She cataloged it as what she always cataloged my silence. Resignation, Passive acceptance from someone who knows they have no argument. What she didn't understand was that I simply had no reason to argue. The kitchen was part of the apartment. The apartment was mine. If she wanted to remodel something that was technically mine without knowing it, it wasn't my immediate problem. It was an investment, if anything. In those weeks, I also noticed that her conversations with Antonia had become more frequent. They called each other almost every day. Sometimes at night, when I was already in the study, I'd hear Carolina's voice lower as she passed the hallway. I didn't need to hear the content. I knew the tone. It was the tone of conversations not meant for my ears. One afternoon, I came back earlier than expected. I left the keys in the bowl by the entrance, as always, and before I could announce myself, I heard Carolina in the living room talking on the phone. I didn't move a step. I stayed in the hallway. Mom, I'm serious. This man has no ambition whatsoever. He's been doing the same thing for years and hasn't grown at all. Me, on the other hand, pause. Yes, exactly. And I'm tired of carrying someone who's not on my level. You've known all along. Another pause. No, not yet, but I'm thinking about it very seriously. I heard the end of the sentence and walked to the kitchen without making a sound. I poured myself a glass of water. I drank it slowly, looking out the window. Outside, the sky was completely clear. I'm thinking about it very seriously. Interesting, because I had also been thinking for a while. And what I'd been thinking had nothing to do with giving up or defending myself. It had to do with something much more precise, with making sure that when the time came, everything was exactly where it should be. Every document, every record, every legal structure, all in order, all clean, all immovable. Manuel had told me once years ago that the difference between a man who builds and a man who loses what he builds is in one single thing. Foresight, knowing in advance what can go wrong and building in a way that makes that error impossible. I had built like that from the beginning, not because I had specifically anticipated Carolina, but because it was the only way I knew how to build, with solidity, with silence, with patience. And while she was telling her mother I had no ambition, I had on my desk the documents for a new acquisition, a commercial building in an area that few people were looking at the time, but that Manuel and I knew was going to triple in value in less than 4 years. The purchase price was $2,300,000. I signed it that same week without telling anyone. There's a particular way that people who underestimate you behave when they're completely sure they have control. It's not aggressive, it's not violent, it's something much more subtle, in a way much more revealing. They relax, they let their guard down, they stop pretending to consider you an equal, because they don't even feel the need to pretend anymore. And that's exactly what started to happen with Carolina in the following months. The change was gradual, so gradual that if I hadn't been paying attention, I probably would have absorbed it as part of the landscape, like so many other things I had absorbed over the years. But I was paying attention, I always had been. It was perhaps the one skill Carolina never gave me credit for, and, ironically, it was the most important one of all. The first episode, One Remember, clearly was a Friday night. Carolina had organized a dinner at home. She didn't tell me with enough notice. She called me at 3 in the afternoon to let me know that guests were arriving at 8. 6 people, her colleagues from work, a couple of friends, and Antonia. Of course, Antonia was always there. I asked her if she needed me to do anything. She said no, that she would take care of everything, that she just needed me to be presentable. Presentable. I got home at 7. The table was already set. Carolina had ordered catering, something she did frequently, because according to her, cooking for guests was a waste of time when there were better options. The wine was on the counter, for bottles. I recognized them immediately because I had chosen them months before and left them in the cellar. Carolina knew nothing about wines. She had never been interested in learning, but that night, when the guests arrived, she presented them as if she had personally selected them with all the knowledge in the world. I sat at the table, listened, observed. There was something fascinating about watching Carolina in that environment. She was socially brilliant. She knew exactly what to say, when to laugh, how to make each person at the table feel part of something important. It was a genuine skill. I had always recognized it. What I also recognized, and what became especially visible that night, was that this skill had a reverse side. Because the same precision with which Carolina built people up in front of others, she also used to diminish them when it suited her. And that night, the person she chose to diminish was me. She didn't do it all at once. She wove it slowly throughout the night with small comments that separately might seem innocent, but together formed a very clear pattern. When someone asked about the apartment and said it was beautiful, Carolina replied, "Yes, I chose it. Miguel let me decide everything. The truth is he doesn't have much of an eye for these things." Soft laughter. I smiled. When the topic of business came up and one of her colleagues started talking about investments, Carolina said, without looking at me, "Miguel handles some little things, nothing large-scale." More laughter. I took a sip of wine. When someone asked me directly what I did, Carolina answered before I could open my mouth. "He's in real estate, small stuff. He's more of a low-profile guy. He doesn't like to talk about work," and then with a perfect smile turned towards me. "Right, honey?" "Right," I said. Antonia looked at me from the other side of the table. There was something in her expression that night that was different from other times. It wasn't the usual cold courtesy. It was something closer to satisfaction, as if she were seeing confirmed in real time something she had been arguing for in private for years, that I was exactly what I seemed, nothing more, nothing less. When the guests left, Carolina started clearing the table with the energy of someone who has just had a successful performance. I asked her if she needed help. She said no. I went to the study, opened my computer. I had 3 emails from Manuel waiting for me, all related to the acquisition of the commercial building we were closing. The final contract was ready. It just needed my digital signature. I signed it that night at 11:15, while Carolina was finishing tidying up the remodeled kitchen with $18,000 that had come from an account she thought she managed, but which was actually part of a structure I completely controlled. I signed a contract for $2,300,000 while she turned off the dining room lights, and I said nothing. The following weeks brought more of the same, but amplified. It was as if that dinner had been some kind of threshold for Carolina, as if crossing it had given her permission to be more open about something she had at least moderated before. She began to talk about her achievements at home with a frequency she previously reserved only for her conversations with Antonia. She'd come home from work and recount her professional victories in detail, her potential promotions, her recognitions, the comments her superiors made about her. All of it said, not as sharing, but as contrasting, as building an argument she didn't quite voice, but that floated in every sentence. "I am this. I've gotten this far. I am on this level. And you implied are not." One Sunday, we went for lunch at Antonia's house. It was one of those family lunches that happen once a month and which I attended because it was part of the unwritten agreement of being married to Carolina. Antonia's house was large, well-decorated, filled with photographs of Carolina at different moments of her life. Her graduation, her first work awards, her travels. I appeared in maybe 2 of those photos, always in the background, always slightly out of focus. That Sunday, while the others were in the living room, I got up to get some water in the kitchen. Antonia was there alone. She watched me come in and said nothing for a moment. Then, with that voice of hers that always had the exact volume to reach only who it was meant to reach, she said, "Carolina deserves someone who is at her level." "Miguel, I've always thought so." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a veiled insinuation. It was a direct statement said with the tranquility of someone who knows they can say it without consequences. I looked at her, fill my glass of water. I said, "You're right, Antonia. Carolina deserves the best." She nodded, satisfied, as if I had just confirmed her point, as if my answer was proof that she was right about me, that I was a man with no character, no pride, no ability to defend my place. I went back to the living room, sat down, and while lunch continued and the conversations revolved around Carolina's achievements, her plans, her bright future, I was thinking about one thing. I was thinking about Francisco, about the documents I'd signed with him so many years ago, about the structure we had built together with a precision that not even Carolina's best lawyer would be able to dismantle. I was thinking about Manuel and the conversation we'd had the week before, where he had confirmed that everything was exactly as it should be. Every property, every share, every record. I was thinking that Antonia had just told me with all the conviction in the world that I wasn't up to her daughter's level. And I thought she was right, that I wasn't at Carolina's level. I was several floors above, and she had never looked down to see it. I went home that night in silence. Carolina talked for almost the entire ride about the lunch conversation, about the plans she had for the next quarter at work, about something Antonia had said that had made her think. She never once asked me what I thought of the lunch. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask me anything. I went into the study, sat down, and opened the file Manuel had sent me that morning. It was the summary of the entire portfolio. Properties, shares, structures, values updated to the last quarter. The total sum, everything included, was $8,900,000. I closed the file, turned off the light, and went to bed. There's a type of intelligence you don't study in any university. It doesn't appear on any framed degree on the wall or in any professional recognition. It's the intelligence of knowing when to act and when to simply observe, of understanding that the most powerful move is sometimes not the one you make, but the one you decide not to make. I had developed that intelligence over years, building it slowly, almost without realizing it, in silence. And it was exactly that intelligence that kept me still during the months that followed, while Carolina moved with a growing confidence that to any outside observer would have seemed like someone who has everything under control. But I wasn't an outside observer. I was the man at the center of it all. And what I saw from that center was something completely different from what she thought she was showing. Manuel called me early on a Monday morning before Carolina got up. We talked for half an hour in the study with the door closed, not because it was necessary, but because it was a habit I had developed over the years. The commercial building we had acquired months ago was already generating its first returns. The numbers were better than we had projected. Manuel was meticulous with his projections, always conservative. And when Manuel said the numbers were good, it meant they were excellent. I asked him how the legal structure was. He confirmed that everything was still clean. Francisco had updated the records the previous month. Every property, every company share, every asset linked to my name was protected behind legal layers that had been built with a single priority: solidity. Not speed, not immediate convenience, solidity. When I hung up, I heard Carolina moving in the room. I came out of the study, made coffee, and when she appeared in the kitchen, dressed and ready to leave, she looked at me for a second and said, "Who were you talking to so early?" It was the first time in months she had asked me a question about anything related to my work. With Manuel, I replied, "Office stuff." She nodded, took her coffee, and didn't ask anything else. That was the only time she came close to seeing what was behind the door, and she closed it herself without knowing, with that quick nod that was her way of saying the topic didn't interest her enough to delve into. I stayed in the kitchen after she left. I finished my coffee slowly and thought about how close I had been at that moment to everything being different. If she had asked, if she had felt even a fraction of the curiosity she never felt, but she didn't. And that door she closed without knowing it that Monday morning was the same one that months later would leave her lawyer without arguments and her without words. The following weeks were the most revealing of that entire period. Carolina had started making decisions that went beyond remodeling the kitchen or organizing dinners without consulting me. They were decisions that had a different weight, decisions that told me more clearly than any conversation where she was heading. One Tuesday, she came home with a folder put on the dining room table in front of me with that confidence of hers that always preceded the moments when she wanted something. She told me she had been talking to her legal department at work and that she thought it was time to better formalize the things they had in common, that she had asked them to review some options to register certain properties jointly so that everything would be more organized. I looked at her, took the folder, opened it, reviewed it page by page calmly, without changing my expression. They were preliminary documents, drafts, nothing signed. But the intent was clear. Carolina wanted to put her name on the apartment. She wanted the car to be registered jointly. She essentially wanted to anchor her name to assets that at that moment had nothing to do with her legally. I closed the folder, left it on the table, and said, "I'll review it carefully and let you know." She frowned slightly. She expected something else. She expected me to ask questions to seem confused, to ask for explanations. Instead, she got 3 words and a calmness she clearly didn't know how to interpret. "When will you tell me?" she asked. "Soon," I replied. I got up, left the folder in the study, and that same night, I called Francisco. I explained what Carolina had tried to do. Francisco listened in silence, as always, and when I finished, he simply said, "There's nothing to register in her name because there's nothing in your personal name to register. The structures are intact. Let her try whatever she wants. She won't find anywhere to anchor anything." I knew, but I needed to hear it from him. The folder never appeared on the table again. Carolina didn't mention the topic again. What I did notice was that from that week on, her calls with Antonia became longer, more private. She started going out some weekends to see her mother and would come home late with that expression of someone who has had important conversations she has no intention of sharing. I didn't ask, I observed. One Friday night, Carolina came home and found me reading in the living room. She sat across from me. She looked at me for a moment in silence, as if she were organizing what she was going to say. And then she said with a voice that tried to sound casual but had a tension underneath that I could detect, "Perfectly. Miguel, have you ever thought that maybe we're not what the other needs?" I looked at her over my book. I waited. "I don't mean it in a bad way," she continued. "But I think we've both changed, that we have very different lives, different goals." I closed the book slowly, put it on the table, and asked her with genuine calm, "What exactly are you saying, Carolina?" She took a breath. "I'm saying maybe we should think about what we each want separately." There was a long silence. Outside, you could hear the traffic. Inside, nothing. After a moment, I said, "Okay, if that's what you feel, let's talk about it." She looked at me. Clearly, she expected more. A reaction, fear, resistance, something to confirm that she had the power in that conversation. What she found was exactly what she always found when she truly looked at me, though she rarely did. A completely calm man, a man who wasn't scared, a man who, for some reason she had never been able to figure out, never seemed scared of anything. That disconcerted her more than any argument I could have given. She got up, went to the room, and I opened the book again. Although in reality, I didn't read another line that night. I was thinking not about the marriage, not about Carolina. I was thinking about the conversation I had pending with Manuel for the following week, where we were going to review a new opportunity that had appeared on the market, a residential property in an area that was currently undervalued, but which the numbers indicated was going to move significantly in the next 18 months. The estimated entry price was $1,700,000. While Carolina was in the room, probably calling Antonia to tell her about the conversation, I was calculating projected returns. That's how our nights had always been, deep down, even if Carolina didn't know it. Her building arguments about what I wasn't, me building assets she never saw. There was something almost poetic in that dynamic, and something completely inevitable in its conclusion. Because when two people live in the same house, but in completely different realities, sooner or later those realities collide. Not with noise, not with drama, with documents, with legal records, with numbers that don't lie and that have no interest in protecting anyone's illusions. Carolina thought she was preparing the ground for a convenient exit. She thought she was positioning herself, that she was being strategic, and she was right about one thing. Someone in that relationship had been strategic from the beginning, but it wasn't her. There's a precise moment when a situation stops being something you observe and becomes something you must move. You don't decide it with your head, you feel it. It's a quiet certainty, without urgency, without drama, that appears one day and tells you that the time for waiting is over and the time for acting has begun. I felt that moment on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the conversation in the living room, where Carolina had first hinted aloud that she was thinking of separating. It wasn't a dramatic event that caused it. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a revelation. It was something small, almost ridiculous in its insignificance. It was a conversation I overheard while passing through the hallway. A conversation between Carolina and Antonia that wasn't meant for my ears, but that reached them with perfect clarity because neither of them had taken the basic precaution of closing the bedroom door. Antonio was telling Carolina to act fast before he realized what was happening, that it was the time, that men like Miguel don't react until it's too late, and by then you have to have everything secured. Men like Miguel. I stopped in the hallway. I listened for exactly 40 more seconds. In those 40 seconds, Antonia explained to her daughter that she needed to make sure she had access to joint accounts, to register her name on the properties before starting any legal process, and to move before I reacted emotionally and made impulsive decisions that would complicate things. Impulsive. I kept walking to the kitchen. I poured myself some water. I drank it slowly, looking out the window, listening to the sound of the city outside. And at that moment, I made the decision that had been maturing for months without me fully acknowledging it myself. It was time to talk to Manuel and Francisco and to set in motion something that until that day had existed only as a possibility. I called Manuel late that same night, when Carolina was already asleep. I explained the situation with a brevity that characterized our most important conversations. Manuel listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a short pause, and then he said, "Do you want us to review the entire scenario?" "Yes," I said. "I want to know exactly where everything is and what can move and what can't. I'll call you tomorrow." The next day, Manuel called me at 9 in the morning with a summary he had prepared overnight. It was exhaustive. Every property, every company share, every legal structure, every link between the different holdings, all reviewed and confirmed. The conclusion was the same one Francisco had given weeks before, but now with updated numbers and with a legal perspective that Manuel had consulted with a lawyer he trusted, an external one, someone who had no connection to Carolina or anyone in her circle. The conclusion was simple and absolute. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that Carolina could claim in a separation process. Not because I had done anything dishonest, but because the structure that Francisco, Manuel, and I had built over the years was legally impeccable. Everything was where it should be. Everything had its reason for being. Everything had been built before the marriage or through structures that the prenuptial agreement didn't touch. Carolina could hire the best lawyer in the country. She could spend all the money she wanted on legal fees. She could spend months reviewing records. And in the end, she would find exactly the same thing that Rafael, her lawyer, would find weeks later with a trembling voice, nothing in her name. But I didn't just want to protect myself. That had been done long before. What I wanted now was something different. I wanted to close a chapter in the right way, without anger, without public humiliation, without confrontations that led nowhere, just with the truth laid on the table at the exact moment, in the exact way. And for that, I needed Carolina to take the initiative. I needed her to be the one to move the pieces. Because if I acted first, the narrative would be different. But if she acted from her position of total confidence, from her certainty that I was exactly what she thought I was, then the revelation wouldn't come from me. It would come from reality itself, and there's no defense against that. So I waited, and Carolina, with a punctuality that almost made me feel something akin to gratitude, didn't take long to move. It was a Saturday morning. I was in the study when she came in without knocking, something she rarely did, and sat in the chair in front of my desk as if it were a business meeting. Her hair was pulled back. She had that expression I knew well, the expression she had when she had made a decision and wasn't there to discuss it, but to communicate it. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Miguel, I want a divorce." Not as a question, not as a conversation, as an announcement. I let it hang in the air for a moment. Then I asked her with my usual calm, "Are you sure?" "Completely," she said. I nodded slowly. "Okay, Carolina." She waited. She expected there to be more, for me to ask for time, to show confusion, to try to negotiate, to ask what had happened, to react in some way that would confirm she had control of the situation. Instead, what she received were 3 words and absolute silence. Her expression changed briefly, not much, but enough for me to notice. "I'm going to talk to Rafael," she said, recovering her tone. "He'll handle the legal details." "Of course," I replied. She got up, walked to the door, and before leaving, she turned for a moment as if she wanted to add something, as if the calmness with which I had received the news needed some kind of explanation she couldn't yet formulate. But she said nothing. She closed the door. I stayed in the study. I heard her footsteps recede down the hallway. I heard the sound of the phone dialing, and I heard, muffled by the walls but perfectly recognizable, the tone of her voice when Antonia answered. An elevated, triumphant voice, the voice of someone who has just executed a long-prepared plan and is sure it has gone exactly as imagined. I opened my computer. I had an email from Manuel from that morning, an update on the commercial building's returns. The numbers for the last quarter had exceeded projections by 17%. The current value of the asset, considering market appreciation, was significantly higher than the acquisition price. I replied with 2 words. Very good. I closed the email and thought about Raphael. Raphael was a well-known lawyer in certain circles. Carolina had mentioned him several times over the years as someone who knew what he was doing. She had consulted him on various occasions for work-related issues, for contract reviews, for that initial prenuptial analysis years ago that had lasted 40 minutes and cost $2,000. He was a competent professional, probably good at what he did, but Raphael was about to face something for which no level of professional competence could fully prepare you, not because the structures were illegal or dubious, but because they were absolutely solid, because every document had its backup, because every record had its history, because Francisco had built something that left no room for ambiguity, no crack through which to drive a contrary argument. Raphael was going to spend days, maybe weeks, reviewing records. He was going to look for the apartment and find a holding company. He was going to look for the car and find another corporate structure. He was going to look for the stake in the company and find a majority shareholder whose name was not Carolina's. He was going to look for accounts, assets, properties, anything that could anchor a property claim. And in every search, he was going to find the same thing, a perfectly constructed legal wall. And at some point in that process, he was going to have to make a call he didn't want to make, with a voice he wouldn't be able to completely control, because there are certain pieces of news that affect even the most experienced professionals when they have to deliver them. I wonder how long it would take Raphael to reach that point. I calculated mentally. It depended on how much access he had to public records, how many resources he dedicated to the case, whether he had hired additional support to speed up the process. A week, maybe 2. Deep down, it didn't matter how long it took. The result was going to be the same regardless of the time it took to get there. That afternoon, Carolina went out to see Antonia. She left with that new energy she had acquired in recent days, an energy that mixed relief and anticipation. The energy of someone who believes the hard work is already done and that what comes next is simply executing a plan that's already won. I stayed home. I called Francisco to inform him that the process had officially begun. Francisco listened, asked a few precise questions about the steps Carolina had indicated she was going to follow, and at the end said something that stayed with me for the rest of the day. Miguel, everything you built is exactly where you left it. No one can move what was never where they think it was. I hung up, poured myself a coffee, sat by the window. Outside, the city continued its indifferent, constant rhythm, unaware that in that apartment, at that moment, 2 people were moving in opposite directions with completely different maps. One with a map full of certainties that didn't exist, the other with a map that had been drawn for years with a precision that no one had had the curiosity to see. Carolina believed she was about to take what was hers. In reality, she was about to discover it had never been hers. And that difference, small in words, was absolute in consequences. The days following Carolina's declaration were, on the surface, the calmest of the last few months. She moved around the house with a different lightness. There was something in the way she walked, in the way she talked, even in the way she looked at me that had changed. It was the lightness of someone who has made a decision and is convinced that decision is right, who is convinced that the weight they were carrying is about to disappear and that what comes next is better, lighter, more in line with what they believe they deserve. She treated me with a new kindness that was paradoxically more distant than her usual coldness. It was the kindness of someone who no longer considers you a problem, the kindness of someone who has already mentally placed you in the past and can afford to be generous because the outcome is decided. She'd ask if I wanted coffee in the mornings. She'd let me know when she was coming home late. Small gestures that in another context would have seemed like consideration, but in this one were simply the minimum courtesy owed to someone who will soon no longer be present in your life. I responded with my usual calm. "Thank you. It's okay, don't worry." And I observed. Raphael had begun his work. Carolina mentioned it to me in passing on a Thursday night with that casual tone she used when she wanted to inform me of something without it seeming like she was informing me. She said Raphael was reviewing some documents, and that in a few days he would have a clearer picture. I nodded, told her that sounded fine, and changed the subject to something completely irrelevant, a series I'd seen mentioned somewhere, something unimportant. And Carolina continued the conversation as if the previous topic had been a minor formality already resolved. What she didn't know was that at that very moment Raphael was hitting the first walls. Manuel confirmed it for me 2 days later, not because he had direct access to what Raphael was doing, but because in certain public records, consultation movements leave traces, and Manuel had people who knew how to read those traces with precision. Someone was reviewing property records linked to my name, looking for the apartment, looking for the car, looking for personal assets, and was finding nothing. I imagined him. I imagined Raphael in front of his computer or the documents his team had prepared for him, finding the same result in every search. A holding company, a corporate structure, a name that wasn't mine directly but led to another structure, and that one to another, and that one to another, until it reached a point where the legal chain was so solid and so clean that there was no way to question it without questioning everything, without attacking structures that had existed since before the marriage and had an impeccable legal history. Raphael was good at what he did, I knew that. And precisely because he was good, he was going to understand very quickly what he was seeing. He was going to understand that it wasn't an oversight, that it wasn't ignorance, that what he had in front of him was the result of years of careful planning. And that understanding of the scale of what he had overlooked was exactly what was going to put that tension in his voice when he finally called. But that hadn't happened yet. And in the meantime, Carolina continued to move with her new lightness, completely oblivious to what Raphael was discovering in his office. One Friday, Antonia came to the house. It was the first time she had come since Carolina had announced the divorce, and her presence had a different energy than previous visits. She arrived with her amplified confidence, with a smile that was wider than usual, with the stride of someone visiting a territory that would soon become of direct interest to her. She sat in the living room, accepted the coffee Carolina offered her, and for a moment looked at me with an expression that in other circumstances would have been humiliating. It was an expression of pity, not open cruelty. Pity. The quiet pity of someone observing a person who is about to lose something important and doesn't know it yet. The irony was so perfect that I had to make a genuine effort not to smile, because the person who was about to discover something they didn't know was not me. It was the woman sitting across from me, drinking coffee in my living room, in my apartment, feeling completely sure of a reality that didn't exist. We talked about unimportant things for a while. Antonia asked Carolina about timelines, about the next steps, with that minimal discretion she used when she knew I was in the room, but which clearly didn't bother her too much. Carolina responded with strategic monosyllables, giving information without giving it, and I remained seated on the armchair with my coffee, listening, observing, being exactly what the two of them expected me to be. The background of the scene, the white noise, the man who required no attention. Before leaving, Antonia stood up, looked at me, and said something I didn't expect. She said with a kindness that was almost worse than her usual coldness, "Miguel, I hope this is for the best for both of you. Sometimes things don't work out, and it's better to accept it." I looked at her, nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, Antonia," I said. "Sometimes reality is completely different from what one believed, and it's better to accept it." She nodded, satisfied with what she interpreted as my resignation. She said goodbye to Carolina with a long hug, one of those hugs or celebrations disguised as consolation, and she left. Carolina closed the door and turned to me with that light smile she had adopted in recent days. "See, my mom doesn't hold a grudge against you," she said. "I know," I replied. "I don't hold one against her either." It was completely true. The weekend passed with that strange normality that endings have when they haven't officially ended yet. Carolina went out with some friends on Saturday. I met with Manuel at his office, something we did occasionally when topics required an in-person conversation. We reviewed the entire portfolio, updated some projections, talked about the residential property we had been considering for weeks, and decided to move forward. Manuel would prepare the documents for the following week. At some point during that meeting, Manuel asked me, bluntly, as was his custom, "How are you with all this?" I genuinely thought about it before answering. "Fine," I said, "better than I expected." He looked at me for a moment. "And when she finds out?" "When she finds out," I said, "everything will already be where it needs to be. There's nothing to change at the last minute because there was never anything out of place." Manuel nodded, and in that nod, there was something that went beyond professional confirmation. There was the recognition of someone who had seen something built from the beginning and who understood better than anyone what that moment represented. The following Monday, Carolina came home later than usual. She entered with an expression that was hard to classify. It wasn't the lightness of the previous days. There was something more tense underneath, something she was trying to hide with the same social skill that had always characterized her, but that at that moment wasn't quite working. I asked if she was okay. "Yes," she said. "Raphael has some questions about certain documents. Just formalities. Just formalities." "Okay," I replied. "If he needs anything from me, let me know." She looked at me for a second longer than usual. Then she nodded and went to her room. Just formalities. That's what Carolina had been told. What Raphael had told her. Instead, it must have been something considerably more complicated, because what Raphael had found in his weeks of review wasn't a formality. It was an architecture, a legal architecture built with a patience and precision that had stood for years and had no intention of moving. That night, while Carolina slept, I stayed in the study longer than usual, not working, just sitting in silence, in the partial darkness of that room that had been my space for 11 years. The place where I had signed contracts no one knew about, where I had taken calls no one heard, where I had built in silence, and without an audience something that was now about to become visible in the only way that truly important things become visible. Not by announcement, not by confrontation, by consequence. I thought about Francisco, about the first time we met many years ago, when I was younger, and he was already the meticulous, silent professional he still was today. He had told me something in that first meeting that stuck with me, with a clarity that time hadn't eroded. He had told me that the best protection that exists isn't the one that activates when the problem arrives, it's the one that's built before the problem exists, the one that makes the problem, when it arrives, find walls instead of doors. I had built walls, and Raphael, in his office with his documents and his records and his voice that would soon be trembling, was discovering exactly that. There was little time left. I felt it with the same quiet certainty with which I had felt everything important in this process. Not as anxious anticipation, as recognition. The recognition of someone who has seen a story unfold exactly as it was meant to, and who knows without a doubt how it ends. Carolina thought she was in the final stretch of a plan she had executed with precision, and she was right. Only the plan that was in its final stretch wasn't hers. Raphael's call came on a Tuesday morning. I was in the study with my coffee still hot on the desk, checking some emails from Manuel when the phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. I had seen it before on Carolina's phone screen, on those occasions when she called him from the living room and I passed by the hallway without stopping. It was the number of a man who charged $500 an hour and who at that moment, when I answered, sounded like someone who would have paid that same amount not to have to make that call. Miguel. A pause. It's Raphael, Carolina's lawyer. I know who you are, Raphael. Good morning. Another silence, longer this time. The kind of silence that isn't an absence of words, but an accumulation of them. Words being organized because the order in which they're said matters, because the person saying them knows that once spoken, there's no way to unsay them. I need to talk to you. There are some things that have come up in the review that I need to understand better. I told him to go ahead. I heard him take a breath, and then, with that voice that carried the tension of someone who has spent days reviewing documents hoping to find something different from what he found, He told me what I already knew, but which I needed to hear from him for the circle to close completely. Miguel, the apartment, the car, the partnership where Carolina thought she had a stake. I've reviewed all the records. I've consulted with 2 additional colleagues to make sure I wasn't overlooking anything. Another pause. None of it is in her name. The silence that followed was mine this time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because that moment deserved its space. It deserved exactly the weight it had. Miguel, are you listening to me? Yes, I said. I hear you perfectly. The apartment is registered in the name of a holding company established before your marriage. The vehicle belongs to another corporate structure linked to the same network, the stake in the company. He stopped for a moment. When he continued, his voice had something extra, not just tension, something akin to the professional amazement of someone who has just understood the scale of what is in front of him. The majority shareholder of that company, Miguel, is you. Carolina has a nominal minority stake that gives her no control or significant property rights in a separation process. I let him finish. I let everything he had said occupy the space of the conversation without interrupting. Is there anything else? I asked. I heard something that could have been a hell breath. We've reviewed all accessible public records. There are no properties, accounts, or assets of significant value registered in your personal name. Everything is structured through holdings and corporate figures that predate the marriage or were established with a legal separation that the prenuptial agreement does not cover. Pause. Miguel, were you specifically advised to structure your assets this way? I've always had good advisors, I replied. Another silence. I need to ask you something directly, Raphael said. His voice had changed slightly. It had dropped a tone. It was the voice of a private conversation, not a formal communication between legal parties. Carolina, did she know any of this? Did you ever explain the structure of your assets to her? The question was legitimate, and my answer was too. Carolina had 11 years to ask, I said. She never did. The silence that followed that sentence was the longest of the entire conversation. Raphael didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, I could perfectly imagine what he was thinking. Not as a professional, as a human being. He was thinking about the conversation he was going to have with Carolina. He was thinking about how you say something like that. How you explain to a woman who believed for years that she knew exactly where she stood, that she never actually knew the ground beneath her feet. I'm going to need to talk to her, he said finally. Of course, I replied. It's your job. Would you be willing to a joint meeting at some point too? Raphael, I interrupted him calmly. You have all the information you need. The documents are public and in order. Francisco, my notary, can provide you with any additional support you require to confirm what you've already found. There's nothing hidden, nothing to hide. There's only a legal structure that has existed since before Carolina and I got married, in which the prenuptial agreement she reviewed with her own lawyer does not modify. There was one last pause. Understand, he said. Have a good day, Raphael. I hung up. I stared at the phone for a moment. Then I put on the desk next to the now cold coffee and leaned back in my chair. Outside, it was starting to get fully light. The morning light was coming through the study window with that particular quality that mornings have after weeks of accumulated tension. A quality that has something of resolution, something of closure, something that closely resembles the deep breath one takes when a long-carried burden finally hits the ground. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel dramatic relief. I felt something simpler and more profound. I felt that things had reached where they were supposed to, that the process that had begun in a dining room with a glass of wine no one had offered me, and a low-spoken phrase not meant for my ears had followed its natural course to that Tuesday morning with a telephone and a trembling voice. I called Manuel. I told him Raphael had called. Manuel listened in silence and then simply said, "How did he sound?" Like someone who just understood something he didn't expect to understand. I replied. Manuel was silent for a moment. "And Carolina doesn't know yet," I said. "Raphael has to call her. How long do you think it'll take?" Not long. He was right. It didn't take long. 3 hours after my conversation with Raphael, I heard the apartment door open. I wasn't expecting Carolina at that hour. It was noon, and she usually arrived after 7, but the sound of the door was different from usual. It wasn't the sound of someone arriving with the daily energy of the end of a workday. It was the sound of someone who has entered a place looking for something they don't exactly know how to find. I came out of the study. Carolina was in the hallway. She looked at me, and on her face was something that in 11 years of marriage I had seen very few times. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was confusion, a genuine, deep confusion. The kind of confusion that appears when the reality one has built for years collides head-on with a completely different reality, and the mind doesn't yet know which of the two is true. "Raphael called me," she said. "I know," I replied. "He called me first." She looked at me for another moment. Then she asked with a voice that was trying to stay firm, but had a small crack somewhere she couldn't quite control. "The apartment is in your name." "It's in the name of one of my companies," I said. "Which is the same thing. And the car, too. And the stake-in. Also." Each answer came with the same calm, without emphasis, without drama, like someone confirming facts that had always existed and simply hadn't been asked about until that moment. Carolina stood still in the hallway, processing, and I could see the exact moment when the confusion began to turn into understanding, not the full understanding of everything implied by what she had just heard, but the initial understanding, the one that comes first. The one that says something you thought was solid was not. "Since when?" she finally asked. "Since before we were married," I said. "The structures have existed since long before I met you." Another longer silence. "Why did you never tell me?" It was the question I had been waiting for. Not with anxious anticipation, with the patience of someone who knows that certain questions are only asked when there's no way to avoid them. I answered her with the truth, simple, direct, unadorned. "You never asked, Carolina." She froze at that sentence, not because it was an attack, but because it was a mirror showing 11 years in which she had had access to everything, in which the information had never been hidden, in which calls were made with the door open and documents were on the table, and Manuel's name had appeared in dozens of conversations without her ever feeling the curiosity to ask what it really meant. "You never asked." 4 words. And in those 4 words was contained the entire story of what had gone wrong between us. Not betrayal, not deceit, but something quieter and more definitive, disinterest, the decision not to look, the arrogant certainty that she already knew everything she needed to know about the man in front of her, and that what she knew was little enough not to deserve more attention. She turned, walked to the room, and before closing the door, she stopped for a second with her back to me, her hand on the frame. She said nothing, but in that second, I knew that something had ended in a different way than she had planned for it to end. I stayed in the hallway, listened to the sound of the room closing, and then, muffled but recognizable, the sound of her phone dialing. Antonia, of course. I went back to the study, sat down, and opened Manuel's email with the documents for the new acquisition we had decided to move forward with over the weekend. The residential property, $1,700,000. All in order, all clean, all exactly where it should be. I signed it that afternoon, April 3rd. Antonia arrived that same afternoon. I wasn't surprised. It was exactly what I expected. When Carolina was in a situation she couldn't handle alone, Antonia appeared. It had always been that way. She was the silent architect of many of her daughter's decisions, the voice behind the certainties Carolina pronounced as her own. The woman who for years had looked at me from across tables and dining rooms with that expression of quiet superiority that now, when I heard the doorbell and opened the door, had been replaced by something completely different. It wasn't the same expression as always. There was something underneath that she was trying to control and not quite controlling. A tension around her eyes, a rigidity in the way she held her shoulders. It was the expression of someone who has received news that doesn't fit the narrative they've built for years and who hasn't yet found a way to reconcile the two things. I let her in. I offered her coffee. She refused. She sat in the living room. Carolina was already there, sitting on the sofa with her phone in her hand, with the same expression she'd had in the hallway. Still confusion, but now mixed with something else. With the beginning of an anger she didn't know exactly where to direct, because the target she had clear for months had suddenly moved to a place she hadn't anticipated. I sat across from them, not in a side armchair, directly in front of them, in the center of the living room, in my apartment, in my space with my usual calm. Antonia was the first to speak. Of course. Miguel, she said with that tone of hers that mixed authority and control in carefully calculated proportions. Carolina told me what happened, what Raphael found. She paused briefly. I need you to explain how it's possible that you structured everything that way without informing your wife. I looked at her. I took a moment before answering, not because I needed to think of the answer, but because that moment of silence had its own weight and its own meaning. Antonia, I finally said, what exactly do you want me to explain? She frowned slightly. That everything is in the name of companies. That Carolina has no legal access to anything she thought was part of her life. What Carolina thought was part of her life, I said calmly, and what was legally part of her life are two different things. The prenuptial agreement we signed establishes separation of assets. Her own lawyer reviewed it. She paid $2,000 for that review. Nothing that exists now contradicts that contract. Antonia looked at me for a moment. Then she said something that in other circumstances might have had some effect on me. But at that moment, in that room, it only confirmed that she was still working with the same wrong map she had used for years. You knew exactly what you were doing, she said. You knew this could happen someday, and you prepared to leave us with nothing. The U.S. didn't escape me. Us. As if she were a direct part of the equation. As if her 11 years of Sunday visits and carefully poisoned comments gave her some kind of stake in what was on the table. Antonia, I said with the same calm tone, I prepare to protect what I built. I did it before I met Carolina, and I did it completely legally. If I had wanted to hide it, I wouldn't have had my work calls in the dining room with the door open. I wouldn't have left my documents on the table. I wouldn't have mentioned Manuel in conversations that Carolina overheard. I paused. She had 11 years. She never asked. Carolina looked up from her phone, looked at me directly, and in her eyes there was something new. It wasn't the look of superiority from recent years. It wasn't the distant look of recent months. It was a look that was searching for something, searching for a crack, an inconsistency, something that would allow her to reframe what she was seeing in a more manageable way. She didn't find it. How much is everything worth? She asked. Her voice was quiet, direct, without its usual tone. The question took me slightly by surprise, not because of its content, but because of its frankness. It was the most honest question Carolina had asked me in years, perhaps in our entire relationship. I answered it with the same frankness. The entire portfolio, with current valuations, is close to $9 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of a pause in a conversation. The silence of two people who have just heard a number that completely reconfigures the map they had in their heads. Antonia didn't move. Carolina didn't either. For a moment that stretched longer than any silence should in a normal conversation, neither of them said anything. It was Antonia who spoke first, and what she said confirmed something I had known for a long time, but which at that moment became completely explicit. 9 million. Her voice had lost its tone of authority. It had something more akin to disbelief. 9 million, and you never. She stopped, reorganized. And everything is structured so that Carolina can't claim any part. Within the framework of the prenuptial agreement you signed, I replied, and the legal structures that have existed since before the marriage. Correct. Antonia looked at me for a long moment. And in that long moment, something happened that I didn't fully expect, though perhaps I should have anticipated it. I saw the exact instant when the narrative she had built for years about who I was crumbled. Not dramatically, not with a visible collapse, but in that silent, definitive way that things that never had a solid foundation crumble. I saw her mind process the distance between the man she had thought she saw for 11 years and the man who was sitting in front of her at that moment. The man with no ambition, the low-profile man. The man who handled little things, the man who would never get to where Carolina had. $9 million built in silence, built without an audience, built while she drank coffee in that same living room and categorized him as the background of her daughter's life. Carolina got up, walked to the window, her back to us, looking outside without seeing anything real, looking at that intermediate point people look at when they're processing something they haven't yet finished accepting. Then she said, without turning, with a voice that had a texture I hadn't heard from her before, "Why did you never tell me, Miguel?" There was no anger in the question. Not at that moment. There was something closer to genuine incomprehension, to the real question of someone trying to understand something that doesn't fit with anything they thought they knew. I took a moment because that question deserved a real answer. Not a strategic answer, not a calculated answer, a true answer. "Because I was waiting for you to ask," I said. "For 11 years, I waited for your curiosity to be greater than the certainty that you already knew everything you needed to know about me. I waited for you to sit down and ask me with genuine interest what it was I did. Not to impress you, not for you to value me differently, but because that's what people who share a life do. They ask each other things, they really look at each other." Carolina didn't turn around. She kept looking out the window, and when I understood that question wasn't going to come, I continued. I stopped waiting. Not with bitterness, I just stopped waiting. Antonia said nothing. It was the first time in 11 years that Antonia had nothing to say in a room where I was present, and her silence had a weight that none of her previous words had ever had. I got up, went to the study, looked for the folder I had prepared with Francisco the week before, came back to the living room, and put on the coffee table. They both looked at it. "There are the documents Raphael will need to confirm everything he's already found," I said. "Deeds, corporate records, history of the structures, dates of incorporation, all in order, all transparent. Francisco is available for any legal consultation your lawyer needs to make." Antonia looked at the folder, then looked at me, and in her gaze, there was something I had never seen in 11 years. It wasn't exactly respect. It was the involuntary recognition of someone who has just understood they spent 11 years looking in the wrong direction. "And now what?" Carolina said from the window, still with her back to us. "Now," I said, "we each go our own way. That's what you wanted, right?" She finally turned, looked at me, and at that moment, in that gaze, there were 11 years compressed into a second. All the dining rooms, all the silences, all the low-spoken phrases not meant for my ears, but that reached them with perfect clarity. Everything was there in that second, and we both knew it. I said nothing more. I picked up my coffee from the table, which was cold for the third time that day, and went back to the study. I left the door open. It took me exactly 3 days to pack what was mine. Not because I had much to pack. On the contrary, most of the things that filled that apartment weren't mine in the sense that one considers things that matter to be theirs. They were objects, furniture, decorations that Carolina had chosen with the same precision with which she chose everything related to the image she wanted to project. Nice, expensive, completely impersonal to me. What was truly mine fit into 2 suitcases and a box, books, some documents I kept in the study, a photograph I'd had since before I met Carolina, a photo of Manuel and me the day we signed our first major acquisition. 2 young men in front of a building that at the time seemed huge and which over the years turned out to be just the beginning. My computer, my leather planner that Francisco had given me more than a decade ago, and that had survived everything that had happened in those years intact. 2 suitcases and a box. Carolina was home during those 3 days, but we moved in separate orbits. Like 2 planets that share the same system, but whose common trajectory has long since diverged. Sometimes we'd cross paths in the hallway or the kitchen, and there would be a brief moment of eye contact that neither of us prolonged. There was no hostility, no dramatic tension. There was something more like the real end of things, which rarely resembles what one imagines, and which almost always has that strange texture of the everyday mixed with the irreversible. The second day, while I was finishing organizing the documents in the study, Carolina appeared at the door. She stayed in the doorway without entering, her arms crossed over her chest in that gesture of hers that wasn't defensive, but rather containing, as if she needed to hold on to something that might otherwise escape. She watched me work for a moment. Then she said, "Where are you going to go?" "I have an apartment. I replied without looking up from the documents. It's been vacant for a while. It was part of one of the properties in the portfolio that we hadn't rented out yet. There was a pause. How many properties do you have in total? It was the second genuine question she had asked me in 2 days. After 11 years, the real questions had arrived when they no longer changed anything. Enough, I said. I didn't say it with cruelty. I said it because it was the most honest answer. The exact number was no longer information that belonged to our conversation. It was information that belonged to what came next, to the life that would continue when those 2 suitcases and that box went out the apartment door. Carolina nodded slowly. She didn't ask any more, stayed a moment longer in the doorway, and then left without saying anything else. And in that final silence, there was something neither of us needed to put into words because it had already been said, not with sentences, but with 11 years of a story that had reached exactly where it was supposed to. The third day, a Friday morning, I finished packing. I put the 2 suitcases next to the box in the hallway. I did a final walkthrough of the apartment, not out of nostalgia, but for the same reason one checks a place before leaving, to make sure you don't forget anything important. There was nothing important to forget. Everything that mattered was in those 2 suitcases in that box, and in 11 years of choices that no object could contain. Carolina was in the living room when I passed by to pick up my things. She was sitting with her coffee in hand, looking out the window, the same window from which she had looked without seeing anything real the day Raphael had called her with a trembling voice. I stopped for a moment. The documents for the legal process are all with Francisco, I said. Raphael has his contact info. There won't be any complications from my side. Let's make it as clean as possible. She looked at me. Why? She asked. And it wasn't a question about the documents. It was a bigger question, a question about everything. I took a genuine moment before answering. Because I never wanted to destroy you, Carolina. I never wanted to humiliate you or leave you with nothing out of revenge. What I built for me, not against you. And what's happening now isn't a punishment. It's simply the consequence of 11 years in which we each lived in our own reality without either of us finding the path to the others. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes had something I hadn't seen in a long time. I don't know if it was regret exactly. Maybe it was something more like the belated recognition of something that, when it was available, wasn't picked up and now, out of reach, was seen with a clarity it hadn't had before. I didn't add anything else. I picked up the suitcases, took the box under my arm, and walked to the door. Before opening it, without turning around, I said, "Take care, Carolina." She didn't answer, and I opened the door and left. The building's hallway had that Friday morning light that had always seemed particular to me. A light that has something of a beginning, even when you're leaving something that's ending. I went down in the elevator with my 2 suitcases and my box. I went out to the lobby. I crossed the main door to the street. Manuel was waiting for me outside, leaning against his car, his hands in his pockets, with that usual expression of his that didn't change much regardless of what was happening. He saw me come out, straightened up, came over, took one of the suitcases without me asking, and said nothing for a moment. We just walked to the car together. As we were putting the things in the trunk, he said, "How are you?" I thought about it, not performatively, genuinely. "Fine," I said, lighter than I expected. Manuel closed the trunk, looked at me over the roof of the car. "And now?" "Now," I said, "we close the acquisition of the residential property, review the numbers for the commercial building for the next quarter, and keep going." He nodded, got in the car. So did I. As we drove away down the street, I looked out the passenger window at the building where I had lived for 11 years. Not with melancholy, not with anger, with the same calm with which I had looked at everything that had happened in that time. It was a building, a well-located real estate asset in an area that had appreciated considerably since I had acquired it. Inside, in that apartment, was a woman who was processing the weight of something she had never wanted to see. And that was no longer my responsibility. My responsibility had always been somewhere else, in the documents signed on time, in the structures built with precision, in the decisions made with complete information instead of comfortable assumptions, in having been, throughout that whole time, exactly what I was, without asking anyone to see it, without needing anyone to confirm it. That is perhaps the quietest and most powerful lesson of all this. Not the one about legal documents or corporate structures. That's just the mechanics. The real lesson is another. It's that a person's value doesn't live in what others decide to see. It lives in what that person builds regardless of whether anyone is watching or not. And there's a fundamental difference between those who need to be seen to know they exist and those who build in silence. Because building is what they are, with or without an audience. I had built for 11 years while Carolina decided there was nothing to see, while Antonia nodded with that certainty of hers that turned out to be completely hollow, while Raphael reviewed documents with a voice that couldn't stop trembling because what he found didn't fit into any of the scenarios he had anticipated. No one had asked me to build. No one had applauded me while I did it, and that had never stopped me, because there are people who need external recognition to keep going. And there are people who carry recognition inside, who know who they are with a certainty that doesn't depend on anyone else confirming it, who can sit at a table where they are diminished and continue to be exactly what they are, because their identity doesn't live in the opinion of those who look at them, but in the solidity of what they have built. I was one of those people. I always had been. The car turned a corner, and the building disappeared from my view. Manuel put on some soft music, something instrumental, no lyrics, no drama. The city continued its rhythm outside, indifferent, constant, completely oblivious to what had happened in that apartment over the last few days. I told Manuel to stop at a coffee shop we knew, a small place where the coffee was good and where nobody knew us and where we could sit for a moment before the rest of the day began. He turned without asking. He knew the place. We sat at a table by the window. We ordered 2 coffees. Outside, people passed by in their Friday rush, with their own stories, with their own burdens and their own certainties, some correct and some as wrong as Carolina's, even if they didn't know it yet. The coffee arrived. I drank it slowly. It was perfect. Manuel looked at me from across the table. You know what surprises me most about all this? What? I asked. That in 11 years she never asked. I nodded slowly. No. And that didn't hurt you? I thought about it honestly. At first, yes, I said. Then it became information, data about who the person I was sharing my life with was. And data, when you learn to read it without emotion, simply tells you what decisions to make. Manuel drank his coffee, looked out the window, then said something that stayed with me for the rest of the day and that I still carry with me. The silence of people who underestimate you, he said, always ends up being more costly for them than for you. I didn't answer. There was no need. Outside, the city went on, and I had documents to sign, acquisitions to close, and a life that had been building itself in silence for many years, and which now, for the first time in a long time, had exactly the space it needed to keep growing without noise, without an audience, without needing anyone to look to know it was real, exactly as always.